Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're enjoying the show, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you don't miss any future episodes.
Sounds good.
Today, we're taking a trip back to a pivotal period in Indian history.
Okay.
The Roundtable Conferences of the 1930s, a story of politics, ideologies clashing, and a nation standing on the edge of huge change.
You can think of it as this high-stakes chess game with the future of India as the big prize. And for those of you prepping for the UPSC exam, this is super important for that GS1 Modern Indian History section.
So let's set the scene. Imagine India, the 1930s. The demand for independence is growing stronger, and the British are facing more and more pressure to let go of control.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the background where these roundtable conferences happened. They were a bunch of meetings organized by the British government in London, bringing together Indian leaders and British officials to discuss India's future governance.
Sounds like a pretty tense situation.
Yeah.
What was it like going into these conferences?
Well, there was a lot of hope, but also a lot of skepticism. Many Indians, they saw these conferences as a possible path to self-rule.
Right.
While others, they saw it as a trick by the British to just delay independence, a way to keep their control.
So there was tension right from the start. Let's talk about that first roundtable conference back in 1930.
Yeah.
This was a big deal, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was the first time that Indians and British officials, they sat down as equals to discuss India's future.
Wow.
But there was a major twist right out of the gate. The Indian National Congress, the largest and most influential political party in India at the time, decided to boycott the conference.
A boycott. Why would they do that? Seems like a big opportunity to, voice their demands.
The Congress, led by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, they saw the conference as a sham. They thought the British weren't serious about giving India real autonomy, and they saw the conference as, well, just a way for the British to stall for time.
So the Congress felt that their absence would send a stronger message than their presence.
Right.
Interesting strategy. So who else attended that first conference then?
You had a mix. Representatives from the princely states.
Okay.
Those were regions ruled by Indian monarchs who had treaties with the British.
Got it.
Also representatives from other political parties like the Muslim League, the Hindu Mahasabha, and the Depressed Classes Association, led by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, could you maybe quickly explain what the princely states were in the context of British India?
Sure. The princely states, they were essentially autonomous entities within British India. They had their own rulers, but their foreign affairs and defense were controlled by the British.
Right.
They were a big part of the Indian subcontinent and a major factor in the politics of the time.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So, with such a diverse group attending, what were the main issues being discussed at this first conference?
One of the main topics was the potential structure of a future Indian government. The British, they were pushing for a federal system where power would be shared between a central government and provincial governments.
And how did this idea of federalism sit with the Indian delegates?
It was a mixed bag. Some saw it as a step towards greater self-governance, while others were worried about the potential for division and conflict between the different provinces.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a concern. What other issues were being debated?
Another big one was the question of separate electorates. This meant having separate constituencies for different religious or social groups, leading to designated seats for those groups in legislative councils.
So rather than everyone voting together, there would be separate voting blocks based on religion or social status. Why was that so controversial?
Well, for many Indian nationalists, like the Congress, the idea of separate electorates was seen as a divisive tactic, a way to fracture the Indian population and weaken the movement for a united and independent India.
So it sounds like that first roundtable conference was facing some serious hurdles, even without the Congress there.
Exactly. And to make things worse, the Congress back in India, they were continuing their civil disobedience movement, which involved boycotts of British goods and institutions and mass protests. This created a really tense atmosphere and made it even harder to find any common ground at the conference.
So round one wasn't exactly a success. What happened next? Did the British try to fix the situation?
Yeah, they did. They realized that without the Congress, the biggest and most influential nationalist party, these conferences weren't likely to achieve much. So they tried to bring the Congress back to the negotiating table.
And that leads us to the second roundtable conference in 1931. This is when Mahatma Gandhi comes in, right?
That's right. But before Gandhi agreed to attend, he negotiated a pact with Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India. This agreement, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, was a big moment.
Okay, let's break down this Gandhi-Irwin Pact. What were the main points of this agreement?
It was a truce, essentially. The Congress agreed to pause the civil disobedience movement and participate in that second roundtable conference. In return, the British government agreed to release political prisoners, withdraw ordinances designed to suppress the Congress, and allow peaceful picketing of liquor and foreign cloth shops. It was a big concession on both sides.
Wow, what a turning point. This pact really paved the way for Gandhi's involvement in that second conference, which I'm sure changed the whole dynamic.
Absolutely. Gandhi being there brought a whole new level of intensity and urgency to the discussions. He came to London as the only representative of the Congress, which in itself was a powerful statement about his leadership within the movement.
Yeah, I can imagine his arrival created quite a stir.
Gandhi was a global figure by this point, known for his philosophy of nonviolence and his commitment to Indian independence. Him being at the conference immediately put a spotlight on the Indian cause.
So, with Gandhi at the table, what was his stance going into that second conference? Did he have specific demands?
Gandhi went in with a clear and firm demand for complete independence, or, as he called it, Purna Swaraj. He rejected any idea of continued British rule and made it very clear that nothing less than full self-rule would be acceptable.
That's a bold stance, especially given the power dynamics at play. How did the British respond to such a direct demand for independence?
The British, led by Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, they were in a tough spot. They were under pressure from both sides, the Indian nationalists who were demanding independence,
Right.
and conservative folks within Britain who didn't want to give up control of India, this jewel in the crown of their empire.
A real political dilemma. What was MacDonald's strategy in dealing with these competing pressures?
He tried to walk a tightrope, offering concessions to appease the Indian side,
Right.
while trying to reassure his own government and the British public that their interests were being looked after. For example, he proposed creating 2 new provinces with Muslim majorities, hoping to address the Muslim League's concerns about being sidelined in a Hindu-majority independent India.
It sounds like he was trying to please everyone. Did it work?
Not really. Gandhi rejected any proposals that didn't offer complete independence. He also strongly opposed the idea of separate electorates, arguing that they would only divide Indians along religious lines.
So Gandhi saw separate electorates as a threat to the vision of a united India. Did this stance align with the views of other Indian delegates at the conference?
Not entirely. While many shared Gandhi's vision of a unified India, some, like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who championed the rights of the Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, felt that separate electorates were needed to make sure they had political representation
Oh,
and to safeguard their interests.
so even within the Indian delegation, there are differences.
Exactly. And this shows one of the key challenges India faced on its path to independence.
Yeah?
There were internal divisions based on religion, caste, and regional interests that made it really hard to present a united front.
It sounds like the second roundtable conference, even with Gandhi there, faced a lot of obstacles. Were there any breakthroughs? Did they reach any agreements?
Well, despite the high hopes and all those negotiations, the second conference ended without any resolution. Gandhi, sticking to his demand for full independence, left London empty-handed. The divisions within the Indian delegation and the British government not wanting to grant complete independence, those were just too big to overcome.
2 conferences down and no resolution. So what happened then? Did they try again? Was there a third roundtable conference?
Yes, there was a third and final conference in 1932. But after the second conference failed and Gandhi came back to India, the mood had changed. The Congress, disillusioned by the lack of progress, boycotted the third conference
Okay.
and started the civil disobedience movement again.
It seems like things were falling apart. What about the British? Were they still committed to these conferences?
The British government was also facing divisions within its own ranks. The Labour Party, which had been in power during the second conference, was now in opposition.
Right.
And they decided to boycott the third conference too.
So both the Congress and the Labour Party were out. Who was left to attend this third conference then?
The attendance was much lower than the previous 2 conferences.
Yeah.
It was mainly representatives from the princely states,
Okay.
some smaller political groups, and of course the British officials. But without those key players, the third roundtable conference was basically a lost cause from the start.
The final act without the main actors. What came out of this subdued third conference?
Well, despite the limited participation and the general feeling of disappointment, the British government did manage to push through some agreements, mostly related to administrative reforms
Okay.
and the structure of a future Indian government.
Right.
These agreements would later form the basis of the Government of India Act of 1935.
The Government of India Act of 1935. So that's a pretty big piece of legislation. But we'll have to dig into that more after a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more insights into those roundtable conferences and how they impacted India's road to independence.
So we've gone over those three roundtable conferences and what came out of them, or, well, what didn't come out of them in some cases. What's really interesting here is that even though they didn't directly lead to India's independence, they were super important in shaping what happened next.
Okay, I see what you mean. How did these conferences, even with their failures, contribute to India's journey to freedom?
They did it in a few key ways.
Okay.
First, they made the British government openly acknowledge the demand for Indian self-rule.
Right.
And they forced them to actually engage with Indian leaders on this issue. Remember, before these conferences, the British weren't really taking the idea of giving independence to India seriously.
So the conferences put the issue of independence front and center, made it a big part of the political conversation.
Exactly. They took the conversation to a whole new level. It wasn't just hushed whispers behind closed doors anymore. It became formal discussions out in the open, on the world stage.
Right.
Second, the conferences gave Indian leaders a platform to explain their vision for an independent India, both to the British and to the whole world.
So it was a chance for them to present their case and build support for their cause.
Precisely. Figures like Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar used these conferences to highlight just how unfair British rule was,
Right, yeah.
to argue for democratic principles, and to make a strong case for India's right to govern itself.
And these arguments, all those calls for independence, they didn't just disappear after the conferences, right?
No, not at all. They struck a chord with people all across India. They fueled the nationalist movement and made the desire for complete independence even stronger. You could say the conferences acted like a catalyst, speeding up the movement toward freedom.
So even though the conferences didn't bring immediate independence, they set the stage for what was to come.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there who are hoping to take the UPSC exam, this is something really important to remember. Understanding how the roundtable conferences shaped the story of Indian independence is key to doing well on those exams.
This is gold for UPSC aspirants.
It is. You might get asked about the importance of those conferences, the stances of different groups, the reasons why they failed in the end,
Right.
and their impact on what happened afterwards.
You could get a question like, explain the role of the roundtable conferences in the Indian independence movement.
Exactly.
Or what were the main points of disagreement during the roundtable conferences?
Right.
Or even, how much did the roundtable conferences contribute to the Government of India Act of 1935?
That's a good one.
So it's not just about remembering dates and names. You have to be able to really analyze these events, understand why different people acted the way they did,
Yes.
and connect the dots to see the big picture.
Precisely. And that brings us to the Government of India Act of 1935, a major result, though indirectly, of those roundtable conferences.
Let's get into that. What were the key parts of this act?
All right.
And how did it change the political landscape in India?
The act was a complicated piece of legislation, but essentially it tried to introduce responsible government in India, even though it was still under British rule.
Right.
It suggested setting up an all-India federation,
Right.
which would bring together British India and the princely states.
So it was an attempt to create a more unified India, at least in terms of how it was governed.
That was the idea. The act also gave more Indians the right to vote in provincial elections.
A move toward more representation, even if it wasn't full democracy yet.
Yes. But the act also had provisions that a lot of Indians didn't like, such as reserving important roles like defense and finance for British officials.
So the British still had a lot of control built into the act.
Exactly. And remember, that all-India federation that the act envisioned, it never actually happened. The princely states didn't want to join. And ultimately, the act only took effect in the provinces of British India.
Sounds like the act was a bit of a mixed bag. Some steps forward, but also limits that kept the British in charge. How did the different political groups in India react to it?
The reactions were mixed, as you might expect. The Congress, although they criticized the act's limits, decided to take part in the provincial elections held under its framework. They saw it as a chance to gain experience in governing
Mm-hmm.
and to push for more reforms from within the system.
A practical approach.
Yes. But other groups, like the Muslim League, were more skeptical. They said the act didn't properly address their concerns
Yeah.
and that it would lead to Muslims being marginalized in a Hindu-majority India.
So this act didn't really solve the communal tensions that were building in India.
It might have actually made them worse,
Oh, okay.
as different groups competed for power and influence under the new system.
And these tensions, they didn't just go away, right?
Mhm.
They eventually led to the partition of India in 1947.
That's right. The Government of India Act of 1935, even though it was meant to bring unity, ultimately failed to find a lasting solution to the complex political issues in India.
It's amazing and kind of sad how an act meant to bring people together ended up contributing to the country being divided.
It reminds us that history is rarely straightforward.
Right.
It's full of unintended consequences and outcomes no one could have predicted.
Okay, we've talked about the conferences, their failures, and the act that followed. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about the people involved. These conferences brought together some of the biggest names in Indian history, right?
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who's getting ready for the UPSC exam, it's really important to understand these figures, their motivations,
Yeah.
and what roles they played in the events leading up to independence.
Let's talk about some of those key players then. We've already talked about Gandhi and Ambedkar. Who else should our listeners know about?
Well, there's Jawaharlal Nehru, who would later become India's first prime minister. He was a big advocate for complete independence.
Yeah. And he was key in shaping the Congress's stance during those conferences.
And what about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League?
Jinnah is a complicated figure and a controversial one. At first, he supported Hindu-Muslim unity,
Okay.
and he went to the roundtable conferences hoping to secure a good position for Muslims in a united India.
But things didn't really work out that way.
No, they didn't. Jinnah became more and more disillusioned with the Congress. He felt they weren't willing to accommodate Muslim interests.
Yeah.
And eventually he came to believe that the only solution was a separate Muslim state, which led to the creation of Pakistan.
It's interesting how the paths of these people crossed and how their beliefs and actions shaped history.
It really shows how much individuals can influence events,
Yeah.
but it also reminds us how complex it all is.
Right.
The interplay of different personalities, ideologies, and historical forces.
And for our listeners, especially those getting ready for the UPSC exam, it's important to not just memorize names and dates, but to really understand the motivations, the arguments.
And the long-term impact of these events.
Exactly. Think critically about these figures. Put yourself in their shoes. What were they hoping for? What were they afraid of? What strategies did they use? How did they try to influence the outcome? This kind of analysis will really boost your understanding and bring history to life.
It's like stepping back in time and trying to wrap your head around the choices they had to make.
Exactly. And it's through this kind of engagement with history that we can truly learn from the past and apply those lessons to the present and the future.
And talking about lessons from the past, one of the key takeaways from those roundtable conferences is how important dialogue and negotiation are in solving complex political problems.
Absolutely. Even though the conferences didn't achieve their immediate goal of getting independence for India, they did show the value of bringing different sides together
Right.
to try and find some common ground.
Even if they didn't succeed right away, they established a model for dialogue and negotiation.
Exactly. And that's a valuable lesson, especially in today's world, where we face so many difficult challenges that require different groups to work together
Yeah.
and to understand each other.
It's a good reminder that even when things are really divided and it seems impossible to overcome the differences, talking is always better than conflict and violence.
Absolutely. It also reminds us that compromises are often necessary to find a solution that works for everyone. Of course, that doesn't mean giving up your core beliefs, but it does mean being willing to listen, to understand where the other side is coming from, and to look for creative solutions that address everyone's needs.
And those lessons aren't just for politicians and diplomats. They're for all of us in our everyday lives and how we interact with our families, friends, and coworkers.
That's a great point. Communication, negotiation, and compromise, those are all essential skills for building strong relationships,
Yep.
resolving conflicts, and creating a society where everyone feels respected and can be productive.
So the roundtable conferences, even though they happened decades ago, offer valuable insights that we can still use today.
Definitely. They remind us to keep talking, to keep trying, and to be willing to compromise
Right.
if we want to find solutions that last.
And they highlight just how complicated history is, how different personalities and ideologies interact,
Yeah.
and how political events can be unpredictable.
Well said. And as we keep looking into this period, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring this fascinating chapter of Indian history. Don't just stop with what we've talked about today.
Yeah, go beyond the textbooks,
Exactly.
read biographies of the main figures, explore primary sources like letters and speeches,
Yes.
and talk to other people who are interested in this key period. There's always more to learn
Right.
and new insights to discover.
And for those of you studying for the UPSC exam, remember that going deeper into the material is what will set you apart.
It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the nuances, the complexities, the human stories behind these historical events.
And it's about connecting those events to the wider historical context, to the social, economic, and cultural forces that shaped them.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.
And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. The things we learn from events like the Round Table conferences can help us navigate the challenges we face today.
Wise words. Now, before we finish up our deep dive into the Roundtable conferences, let's shift gears a bit and think about what could have been. Imagine the Congress hadn't boycotted that first conference. What do you think might have been different?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
One that historians have been discussing for ages. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's definitely possible that if the Congress had been at that first conference, things might have gone differently.
How so?
Well, if Gandhi and other Congress leaders had been actively involved right from the start, they might have had more influence on the agenda, and they could have pushed for bigger changes. The whole dynamic of the negotiations would have been completely different.
Right, instead of other groups trying to step in when the Congress wasn't there, you'd have had the main players in the independence movement right there at the table, talking directly to the British.
Exactly. And that could have led to the British taking their demands for full independence more seriously, instead of just offering those small, gradual reforms that they were willing to give at first.
Yeah.
It's possible that there might have been a different path to independence, one with less division and conflict.
It's amazing to think about how one decision can have so many consequences. The Congress boycotting that first conference was a bold move, but it also had big repercussions.
Absolutely. It shows how complicated historical events are
Mm-hmm.
and how hard it is to know what will happen. Every choice, every action creates ripples that can be felt for generations.
And that's the beauty of history. It's a tapestry made up of so many threads, each one representing the choices people made, the forces at play in society, and the unpredictable twists and turns of fate.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the Roundtable conferences, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep digging into this fascinating period. Don't stop with what we've covered here.
Yeah, dive deeper. Read biographies of those key figures. Look at original sources like letters and speeches. And talk with other people who are passionate about Indian history. There's always something new to learn
Right.
and new perspectives to uncover.
And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. The lessons we take from the Roundtable conferences about the importance of dialogue, compromise,
Right.
and understanding the needs of all parts of society, those are just as important today as they were back then.
Wise words. Now, before we say goodbye for today, let's give our listeners one last question to think about.
Great idea.
Imagine you were a delegate at one of these conferences.
Okay.
What would your vision for India's future have been?
Right.
What compromises would you have been okay with making, and what would have been your absolute deal breakers?
It really gets you thinking. Putting yourself in the shoes of those historical figures can help you understand the tough choices they faced.
It's like we're playing a historical role-playing game,
Right.
but with consequences that actually mattered.
Exactly. And, thinking about those consequences, one thing that really stands out about the Roundtable conferences is how they show just how hard nation building is, especially in a society as diverse and complex as India.
Can you say more about that? What made it so challenging?
Well, you had so many different groups with their own interests.
Right.
Religious groups, caste groups, regional factions, political parties. They all had their own agendas and goals.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you had the British
Right.
trying to manage all these competing interests while also holding on to their own power.
Sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It definitely was a volatile mix.
Mm-hmm.
And the roundtable conferences, even though they were supposed to bring everyone together,
Right.
they kind of ended up revealing those cracks in Indian society. And in some ways, they actually made the tensions worse.
So even though these conferences were meant to lead to a united and independent India, they also showed how deeply divided the country was.
Exactly. And if you're studying for the UPSC, this is important to remember. The roundtable conferences weren't just about the struggle between India and Britain.
Right.
They were also about the struggles within India itself.
Mm-hmm.
The different ideas people had for the future,
Yeah.
and the challenges of creating a national identity from all these different communities.
So it's about understanding those internal dynamics
Yes.
just as much as the external pressures.
Exactly. And those internal dynamics, those simmering tensions, they didn't just go away when India became independent.
Yeah.
They continued to shape India's politics and society for years to come.
It's a good reminder that history doesn't end with one event.
Mm-hmm.
It's an ongoing process.
Right.
And the choices made in the past keep affecting us today.
Well said. And that's why learning about history is so important. It helps us make sense of the present, understand this complex world we live in,
Yeah.
and maybe even make better decisions for the future.
And for anyone prepping for the UPSC, studying history isn't just about passing an exam. It's about developing those critical thinking skills, the ability to analyze,
Right.
and a real understanding of history,
Yes.
all of which are so important for being good leaders and informed citizens.
Exactly. History is not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world,
Right.
the choices we make, and the legacy of those who came before us.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the roundtable conferences, let's leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Sounds good. How about this? If you could go back in time
Okay.
and talk to the delegates at the roundtable conferences,
Mm-hmm.
what would you tell them? Knowing what you know now about how things turned out,
Right.
what advice would you give them?
That's a great one. Something for our listeners to ponder as they continue to explore this fascinating period in Indian history.
And remember, history isn't something you just watch from the sidelines. It's a conversation that we're all part of. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.
And if you like this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into history. Until then, happy learning.